Pewno nie
Słuchaj,
miał ci kto tego powiedzieć.
jak dojrzymy, to przyjdziesz do mnie.
Ja wiem, że sam tobą wydaje się spotkanie. Ale naprawdę,
No to chodź.
Nie ma.
Jak powiedziałeś?
Kocham. Się nazywa.
Tego nie ma.
Yes.
Kochacie się.
Hello and welcome to Outside the Wall. In this episode, we are going to be talking about a short film about love. It is a longer version of a TV version of the Dekalog by Krzysztof Kieslowski, and I know I butchered that Polish name, so I apologize to any Polish listeners. I am Wallenstein, joined by my co-host Raymond Exteth.
Hello.
Hello.
And so, just as a brief synopsis, this is the Decalogue in general is a sort of modern secular take on the Ten Commandments, and it takes place. All the Decalogue episodes take place in 1980s Poland, and this one is a longer version of Decalogue number 6. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Exteth and with his thoughts.
Okay, so Raymond and I watched the full Decalogue, I think a couple of years ago now. It's been a little while, so I'm a little fuzzy on some of the details. But yes, it's definitely a sort of transformative reinterpretation of the Ten Commandments. So I think, if I'm remembering right, the first episode deals with the commandment against idolatry, or it might be the commandment against having other gods besides the main deity, and the way the director transforms that is by having it as a sort of idolatry of science. And this episode takes the commandment against covetousness and sort of use it to talk about the ideas of love and obsession. I think in general, the strength of the Decalogue is definitely not in the beauty of its visuals or the high quality production values, but it's more in the depth of the storytelling and sort of the complexity and ambiguity that comes along. So I think something I picked up on in this story that's interesting is that, well, what we might call the protagonist is initially obsessed with this woman who lives across the street from him. Those two roles kind of reverse by the end of the story, and it ends up being her who has this obsession and infatuation with him. It's definitely a slower pace, sort of, in some ways, awkward film production. It might turn off some less patient viewers, but I think all 10 episodes of the Decalogue are definitely worthwhile. This one might be one of the weaker ones overall, but that's more a testament to the strength of the general collection than an indictment of this one. I guess I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Rain.
Okay, so yeah, it has been a couple of years since we watched this. It's also not on my favorite episodes, but this is actually an extended version, and the movie itself does have the major difference between the episode version and the film version is the ending. I think the overall message is very similar, but there is some slight changes to it that I think I'm preferring how the episode ends. I do agree that it's not. This doesn't mean that it's a bad episode. It's quite. I think it's pretty great, and I do enjoy it throughout. I do like how Tomek goes from the obsessive, and I remember that Wally made a comment when we were watching the film that he goes through all of the stereotypes of an adulterous man in order to approach Magda, who is the woman that he has become obsessed with. I thought it was pretty amazing. I hadn't actually noticed that the first time I saw this with Exted, but I do think that it is a more, let's say, cynical, to a certain extent, cynical view on romance. At least that's part of what Magda appreciates at the beginning. But she does come to change of mind when she starts becoming more attached and obsessed with Tomek and the actions the attempted suicide that he had after she basically just told her that there's no love but there is only sex. And the Decalogue itself is quite an excellent collection. The 10 episodes that we're watching, and I think also the extended versions of the films are also very good. I think if I do prefer a short film about killing, but this is still quite an excellent watch, and I don't want to drag on too much with this. So, Wally?
Yes, so I actually had picked up the Criterion Collection's version of Decalogue based on both of your recommendations. I haven't made my way through all of it yet. I actually had just watched the 6th one, which this extended version is based off of. I am liking it so far. I am enjoying it, and I'm looking forward to finishing the remaining four. But uh, this, the one thing I think the modern lesson one can take from watching this, at least very initially on the beginning of the movie, is this is why some of us are a bit paranoid about keeping our windows and blinds open, because it starts off with Tomek spying on Magda without her consent and watching what she does and kind of all the different relationships that she winds up having, and to the point of being obsessed with her, where Tomek eventually uses his job in the post office to try and bring her to the post office just to see her, and then winds up later in the movie taking on the role of the local milkman so that he can come to her front door and see her, and kind of comes up with excuses to do so. And one of them at his job kind of backfires a bit when Magda asks him to see his supervisor, although it also backfires for Magda as well. But this definitely, I think, I would agree with Raym, a much more cynical take on love. That you have Tomek, who kind of has this very idealized, non, almost spiritual idea of love, that it's very non-carnal. I mean, he even admits it when Magda confronts him eventually about it, that he doesn't want to have sex with her, he doesn't want to kiss her, he just loves her and just doesn't want anything from her at all. And what I think is unique for me out of all the Decalogue episodes I've seen so far is that you have a sort of shift in audience view. At the very beginning of the shot of the movie, we see everything through the lens of Tomek. And then up until the point when, or like about 2/3 of the way through, the point of view shifts to Magda. And then now you're viewing everything out of Magda's own eyes and Magda's own apartment as well, or complex. And I think that to me was interesting, seeing that shift. And at the same time, as Xdeath had mentioned, that shift in obsession, or not, maybe obsession is a bad word in Magda's case anyway, but that desire for the person who is loved and the person who is loving or giving love. And that shift, I think, to me was very interesting in how it very much flip flopped. And by the end, depending on which version you see, if it's the TV version or this extended version, one's a little more happier ending, if I can use that word. But it's overall, I think it's not the strongest episode I've seen so far. And again, I haven't seen the remaining 7, 8, 9, and 10, but I still enjoy it overall, and I'm looking forward to finishing off this Decalogue.
So when you mention Tomek's ideal of love and how it does become like it is an ideal in the sense that it is something that may be impossible, most likely so. But it does also remind me of there's a character from one of Milan Kundera's works, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, and how this character ends up losing what was his lover, but yeah, this lover ends up becoming for him like a goddess, and I think he actually describes her as like a goddess in a way that she has become his ideal of a woman, even if she will no longer be there for him because she rejected him and left him. He still adores her in his own manner, and I think it is a bit similar to Tomek's case and how he views Magda, how he has this idealized version of her through her observation, but even though he has never really interacted with her, since the only interaction they both had been the short moments with he has managed to get her to show up at the post office for the fake claims that he has created. But it does create how destructive and damaging this can be to the fact that latching on to an ideal for too long.
Yes, and definitely, I think modern American audiences, or just modern audiences in general, looking at this would definitely, I think, react much differently to Tomek than Magda would. I mean, to the point where they would call, at least in the U.S. here, I would definitely see the police being involved. I mean, it's he essentially stalks her. That's the bottom of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't have to showcase the best game, and is certainly not intended as a target for emulation.
Yes, the one of the first words that popped into my mind when watching Tomek interact was the more modern phrase that we see now in political discourse is incel. And this is kind of like the same sort of, without the hostility that some modern incels tend to have towards loving.
Yeah, Tomek goes all the way to be a mere cock blocker when one of Magda's lovers shows up and he just calls the gas company
The
that there
gas company.
may be a gas leak in her apartment, just so he doesn't get any action. So yeah, I think that is appropriate more time for Tomek.
There's also, I think, to hint at that Tomek might be either autistic or somewhere on that spectrum, because when Tomek and Magda wind up going on their mini ice cream date, he mentions that he studies languages and has a very good memory and can remember almost anything, which I think me was kind of a cue of maybe this is also why Tomek is very awkward, to put it mildly, when showcasing his love for someone.
Yeah, he definitely showcases almost arrested development in terms of his social and emotional skills, and I think the particulars of his psychology are definitely part of the story that's being told here, and I think that's something we can say for the Decalogue in general too, is that it's quite psychological in its intentions.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting for me from a storytelling point too is a rather minor character, the female that Tomek winds up living with. It's expected, in most stories, that this must be his mother, and we find out no, it's not. It's his best friend's mom, and his best friend is up working as a soldier in the UN out, I believe it was Syria, and the mother later comments that he might, even if he does return, it's going to be very briefly. So there seems to be this very much this hole in this character's life between her and her son, and almost I get that sense that she kind of is trying to fill that with Tomek, but at the same time, her reactions to when she does find out that what Tomek is doing is very mild, which again is a bit surprising. But
Yeah, it does. It's very much like Tomek is the surrogate son, and I imagine that I also I also thought that the reactions were mild, but I assumed that it was in part because she's clearly trying to project her maternal side on Tomek, and I mean she expresses in the film once that it wouldn't really bother her if he brought like a woman to the apartment. I think she has this desire of seeing him pair up, and like I imagine that seeing in a way that Tomic's future children will be like her grandchildren.
right, and then she even does become somewhat protective of Tomek when Magda tries and calling for him or asking his whereabouts, making sure he's okay. She is very defensive, very blunt, and is basically insinuating. You can tell from just the interactions and the actors themselves, their facial expressions, that it's she's basically saying, get lost. Like, we don't want to see you. You've hurt Tomek, and that again, that maternal protective instinct definitely I noticed kicked in.
Yeah, so she's definitely more judgmental towards Magda than she is to Tomek, which is interesting because I think for most audiences, we would say that things Tomek does in this show are worse, morally speaking, than anything Magda does.
Indeed, Magnus is emotionally honest, so any reaction that she has done isn't really reproachable. I don't think really, at least from, but I don't feel that she was in the wrong at this. But it does seem that she is trying to, what's the correct word, like help Tomek heal properly from the emotional rupture of anything that wasn't really there. And yeah, the mother, the best friend's mother is super protective of him. I think this is something that, at least I remember, perhaps you that you just recently saw the episode, Wally can comment, but I think this side is a bit less prominent the mother side is a bit less prominent in the episode than on the movie.
Yes, I think that's one of the few scenes that are actually cut from the TV episode, is there isn't too much interaction with Magda and the mother as there is in the longer film. But I don't think it necessarily changes that much. I mean, you can either version you watch, you can get that notion that
Mm-hmm.
she's very protective or becomes very protective of Tomek.
So, okay, so I want to return to the figure of the missing best friend because I think it should be noted that he's not just a sort of void for his mother, he's also that for Tomek. And especially this is communicated in the fact that the best friend was originally the one who was spying on Magda, actually, and introduced that hobby to Tomek. So you could even say that Tomek continuing to participate in his absence is sort of like a way of connecting with his missing friend.
Yes, it's interesting you say that because it makes me think now that the the friend was almost a very malign influence, almost, since this is sort of the themes in the Decalogue, almost a metaphor for like a demon type of influence that was on Tomek. And we see, as he admits to Magda later on, that since his friend has left, he's become less and less grotesque in his obsession with Magda.
Yeah, he used to masturbate to her, and then he stopped, I believe, after that.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't thought of that before, but that may be a valid interpretation.
I think it is an appropriate way to see it, how the friend was the greater malign influence. I think that even if, in a way that even though Atomic doesn't really have any more sexual releases from observing Magda, he has is still very much like pivoted. Done have a pivot for whatever he has. His obsession was trying to achieve with Magda. The fact that he breaks into the postal office, forges the mailing notices, the fact that he gets a job just to spy on her, that he keeps trying to cockblock her lovers, calls her just like and doesn't talk and just hands up. I think even if we might say that his friend had been a malign influence, has still very much continued on his own and expanded on other areas.
Yes, although he does, to be fair, get his comeuppance by one of the Magda's lovers, and that the lover actually calls him out literally, and winds up giving him a pretty good whooping.
Yeah, that one is interesting because I think it's Magda who tells that guy that Tomek is watching, and that's what gets him to leave. But he also had the option of the big dick move of just continuing to have sex with her anyways.
Yeah,
Right.
it is Magda that lets him know that, and he is I think he wasn't too much of an exhibitionist.
No.
Yeah, I think that this is probably one of the better representations of voyeurism that there are. How you can, at least I feel we all agree that Tomek's actions are really reproachable, and the film doesn't really make it seem like you have to accept them. So I think that was actually pretty well done.
Right. I think maybe to shift the conversation, what I want to talk about a bit is that actual change in perspective, and how, as Exdeath originally pointed out, that at the beginning of the film we see that Tomek is obsessed and in love with Magda, and then about two-thirds of the way through the film, that perspective shifts, both literally in the way the audience is viewing, who the audience is viewing through, and in the characters themselves. So that Magda now, I wouldn't necessarily say she becomes obsessed, but more, I think, concerned. I mean, I do think she winds up loving him in a way, but it's more out of a concern, out of what she had done, and realized that she wants to try and fix and correct that mistake she made. And realizes, I think, at least this is my interpretation, is that she realizes what she was saying to Tomek about love, and her concept of love, that it was strictly just a carnal sort of thing, was mistaken. And in her desperation to try and let Tomek know that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the most important takeaways from that whole transition is that the reason she becomes, let's say, infatuated with him is because of that idealism that he represents. There's something in her that still wants to hold on to that in some way, and so she's not only more interested in him, but also I guess upset that she sort of disturbed that part of him.
Indeed, I think that at least the key differences that I mentioned why I prefer the episode ending a bit more than the film one is the fact that in the episode ending, even though she has come to appreciate the ideal and want that kind of caring but not sexual side that Tomek was professing, she finds out that she has also lost that from Tomek. While in the film, it is a bit more like, let's say, like a fairy tale, like a more like, as you had mentioned, seems happier, but it's not necessarily so. In that she picks up the magnifying telescope or binoculars that Tomek will see through her apartment, and she imagines a previous event where she had felt some despair and she spilled some milk, and Tomek was there. Well, she imagined Tomek was there to comfort her. I think that, but as you mentioned, the realization that she had been longing for that, and she was in the wrong. But I feel the more bitter ending of the episode is a bit stronger.
Yes, so I guess we should, for our audience's sake, sort of explain the differences between the two endings. So in the TV version, the ending winds up having Magda discover that Tomek is okay after he initially slits his wrists and is sent to the hospital. She sees him at the post office and walks up to him, and there's kind of this pregnant pause in between who's going to be the first to say anything, and then Tomek winds up breaking that and saying that he doesn't watch her anymore. So there's this almost sort of very cynical take, at least from my view, that it's almost that she has passed on her worst traits to him now, that if like someone winds up spying on him, he's going to wind up hurting that person now in the sort of pent up vengeance after having his sort of, if we can call it innocence, taken away by Magda.
Yeah, and in contrast to that, the film ending is that she does start spying on him actually, and sees him with another lover. And so both of these definitely communicate that Tomek has moved on from her, and they also communicate what Wally just pointed out, the sort of transition of some of her negative traits to him, because he's now kind of loose with his lovers, you could say, in the
Yes.
same way that she was promiscuous before.
Yes, and bitter as well, just as she was.
So I think what the two endings communicate is actually quite similar. It's just that the method the director has chosen to communicate it with is slightly different.
I would say what the movie version is probably slightly less cynical than the TV version. And actually, the ending for the movie version was based on the recommendation of the main actress who plays Magda to Kozlowski. So I think because she had read the script, according to the sources that I've read, she read the script and sort of thought that there could have been a little lighter ending to it and not as kind of brief. If I can, it's not the best choice of words, but it's very, very much less of a story and more of a, in line with the rest of the Dekalog TV shorts.
Yeah, I agree with that. They're a bit similar, but as I mentioned, but it does also present the fact that even though she has been Magda herself has been wronged by having her privacy invaded and being harassed by the false claims. Magda herself just showcased a trait that she is quite forgiving, even if I think coming up more as to say that, as Wally mentions, it's not that she's obsessed with Tomek, but she has become quite attached to him, and I think that's quite nice in a way that she is, at least in the film, it does present her with a lighter, well, as you mentioned, it's lighter take, so it does leave like Magda with a more the potential of a happier future than the film, and the fact that her forgiveness may actually help her in the long run.
Right. So one thing I do want to talk about, I think any Decalogue fan is going to demand we talk about, is the mysterious character that is in every single, or almost every single, Decalogue episode, including this one, played by Artur Barsis. And the metaphor, at least from what the bits I've read is that it's supposed to be this character is supposed to be a metaphor for the spirit or like the conscience of each of the main characters in each episode, and kind of following them and guiding them to do the right thing. So, your guys' thoughts on the character?
Okay, Rain, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. When we had seen the series, usually I tended to mention that that was God in a way, or at least a representation of God. I think that it's not necessarily that, but it does seem to be like he is in a way like a spiritual guide or figure that is. I mean, the Decalogue itself is set on this apartment complex, or at least this. I'm not sure if it was the same apartment complex, but it is like the same location essentially.
Yes, it's. I
Where
think it's supposed to be the same apartment complex where all of these characters live in the same building.
Yeah, that's right.
so it is, as you mentioned, in a way, conscience to them. That he does show up usually in key moments or crossroads. To From the top of my mind, I think the moment that comes to me is from the first episode when the father is he's in this bonfire and at night, and he's pondering about if I remember correctly, the calculations of the resistance that the ice may have, so his child may skate on it. He's like right there at the moment, and I do think that it's not necessarily God, but it does maybe like as we may mention, not necessarily a guardian angel, but close to that, a spirit representation that is there to either observe them or perhaps help them just with that kind of facial language that to ponder more on whatever they are going to do.
Right.
I do think it does have like it's a bit of the surrealness of the Decalogue.
Yeah, so in this film, what we see from that character is that he first sees Tomek after Magda's first agreed to go out with him, kind of running around with his shopping cart, very happy, and he kind of smiles upon that. And then later on, when Tomek's more distressed, he also reacts to that. And I think that does kind of show that he's like this moral compass for the viewer, because his reactions to things, like to those two things, would definitely align probably with what the director's thinking. One thing I will add, though I think we covered it pretty sufficiently otherwise, is that I've read somewhere, although I don't know if I could find this again, that when asked about it, Kieslowski basically commented that he had no idea what was up with that guy or what the significance of him was supposed to be.
Well, before I forget that topic you just brought up, sounds very similar to me to Tolkien's explanation for something like Tom Bombadil. And in Tolkien's words, even some things that an author or a person creates, even they don't know, because that leads to part of the mystery of that particular character. So that sounds very similar to me in this case.
Yeah, I find that with my own writing sometimes, that there's that, or that certain angles or connections between things, I'll become aware of them like as I'm writing, but when I initially come up with the idea, I won't see that. So I guess that may just show the degree of interpretation that art is subject to.
Right. So for me, I agree with Raim that the first Decalogue is one of the more noticeable appearances of the stranger, and the other version for me is in Decalogue number 5, or if you also watch the expanded short film about killing, is he winds up being one of the traffic stop guards, or I don't know what in Poland they're officially called, but as the main character who winds up being the one who murders a taxi cab driver, makes eye contact with the stranger, and you can see the stranger sort of shake his head no, almost trying to tell him, convince him not to carry out this vile act. So to me, I mean, I definitely see it in a much more secular sense, just because the Decalogue in general is a more secular modern take on something that's religious. So for me, I would say it's either like a sort of semi-spiritual guide, or just each character's conscience kind of telling them and reminding them what they're about to go through, or they, as Exdeath mentioned, they show up at critical points in the story as reinforcement of that particular character's kind of compass and where it's at. I'll wrap it up then. So, as a synopsis, this is a longer version of Decalogue number 6, and it's only longer by, say, maybe 25 minutes. Each of the Decalogue episodes are only an hour long to begin with. So, I personally would recommend maybe watching a short film about killing first if you're interested, if any of this sounds interesting to anyone listening in, to get an idea of more of what the Decalogue can do. Or I would recommend watching at least the first episode of the Decalogue, because that to me so far is one of the stronger episodes, if not the strongest episode. But overall, these are the types of stories that I think or types of filmmaking that I kind of look at when I watch movies. I want something that kind of brings out this more deeper metaphorical discussions, and something that I can continuously think about as I'm watching, or even after I've watched the film weeks and weeks later. So that's all for this episode. So thank you all for listening, and we will all see you next time.